Hi guys, welcome back to Log Cabin Gaming. Today we're going to do something different for the channel, and we're going to fast forward 40,000 years into the future for my first Warhammer 40,000 tutorial on this channel. The subject for today's tutorial is this awesome Knight Abominant that I painted up for my good friend Sam. This video isn't the whole tutorial on painting the entire model, but more dedicated to painting the lightning effects of the armour, which, let's face it, is practically the whole model anyway. If you enjoy this video and are curious to see how I painted the rest of the model, please jot that down in the comments below and I'll put together a video on that, as I do have the footage for painting the entire model. Because Sam wanted to utilise the Psyker abilities of the Knight, I decided to go for a green warp storm style effect on the armour panels, crackling with lightning. This would serve as showing the model was heavily influenced by the incredible powers of the Immaterium. And as he also collects Necrons, the green would fortuitously tie in with that army as well. More so by dumb luck than design. Whilst lightning effects are great fun to do, we need to do a bit of prep work first before we get started. I assembled the kit as sub-assemblies, mainly keeping the weapons and shoulders separate so I could get to all the bits easily. I also magnetised the top of the model to make it easy for Sam to transport when gaming. Laying the background is much easier if you have access to an airbrush, but if you don't, then don't fret. I'll post a short video on how to achieve the same results without using an airbrush, and I'll put a link in the description below. Okay, now that that's all out of the way, let's start painting the armour. First of all, to create the warp style storm, I'm going to lay down a dark green base coat with the airbrush all over the armour panels. I'm just going to show you here on the shoulder section, but it's exactly the same for every armour piece on the model. You can also use a normal brush if you wish, but if you have access to an airbrush, this makes the whole process so much easier, faster and smoother. I'm using Caliban Green here, but you can go ahead and use any dark green. You can also swap out the green to be any colour if you're choosing, by following a similar technique of just going from dark to light. Leaving the Caliban in the corners, I'm going to add a lighter green and blend that in to help create the image of the warp sky. In this case, I'm using Warboss Green. And once I've done that, I'm going to go lighter again and start adding Elysian Green to the canvas, as it were. I then add a bit of white to the Elysian Green whilst it's still in the airbrush to get the final highlights, because at this point I ran out of similar greens, so adding white helps to keep it a consistent palette. The next step is optional, but I wanted to create a starry backdrop for the lightning to eventually go over. So I've grabbed an old ratty toothbrush that I just keep on hand for occasions like this. I dip the end in a bit of watered down white paint and I flick the toothbrush to dislodge the white paint as a fine mist over the green backdrop, and to create the impressions of stars on a magical storm sky. And this will help sell the effect of the warp storm effect that I want to try and portray. Once this is done, I then use two washes, Nuln Oil and Athonian Camoshade, to help blend it all together. I use the Nuln Oil mainly in the corners to darken the edges even more and create more contrast, and blend the Athonian Camoshade from the centre going outwards. This gives the armour panel a nice green hue, but also exaggerates the darker edges we've just done with the Nuln Oil, and it smooths out any transitions through the various greens. Especially if you've brushed the greens on manually, this will really help smooth the transitions. Now that the panel is done, it's time to hit up the trim. I really like Liberator Gold for my trims and verdigris, but as it's a layer paint, it's designed to be transparent, so it covers poorly. So to combat this, we need to do one of two things if you want to use it as your final colour. One, you can either mix it with a silver base style paint, such as Iron Hand Steel, to give it opacity and coverage power, but still with the Liberator Gold finish. Or we can paint the trim in a base style gold first. I opted for this method by using Retributor Armour, as I didn't want to have to worry about getting the same silver to gold mix ratio over the entire model. Once the Retributor Armour is dry, you can then layer on Liberator Gold to achieve this nice muted gold colour. I use the term muted because we want to focus the viewer's attention onto the armour panels and not the gold trim. Once it's dry, I use the contrast paint Wyldwood mixed with a little bit of contrast medium to add some shading to the gold and give it a bit more depth. If you've got a bit slap happy with the Wyldwood, because it can run away with you, you can always switch back to Liberator Gold to tidy up any pieces. The final bit for the armour is just to take a bit of silver. It can be any silver, but I'm using Vallejo Game Colour Silver here, and just do a quick edge highlight. It's mostly straight edges on this model, so it's nice and easy to do. And the good news is now, save for the lightning effect, the armour is pretty much done. So now we can get on to the fun stuff, the lightning bolts. Okay, first thing we're going to do is we're going to get some wild flesh. Now, it doesn't need to be wild flesh, but because we used Caliban Green on the shoulder pad, we want it to be slightly different. We want a discernible difference, so I wouldn't use Caliban Green. If you don't have wild flesh, you could potentially just mix Caliban Green with a bit of white or something to get a different shade of green. So it's nice and thin, and what I'm going to do, and you can use reference material, where we're going to draw the outline of a lightning bolt, just starting at the top. You're hardly going to be able to see it at the minute if I reflect it there. So you're just going to come up with some random lines, and you can use reference material or even pictures of actual lightning bolts to give you an idea. Right, when you've got that outline, we're going to take that wild flesh that we used, and we're going to add a whole bunch of water to it to kind of make it into a glaze. We're going to make it a bit runny to this kind of consistency. Okay, and what we're going to do, we're going to glaze our outline that we've just done, and we're going to glaze from the outside in, and this is to give it like a blurry night sky effect. So this will do two things. One, it's going to give us a bit of blur, so it's going to enhance our lightning bolt later. But two, as you can see, what it's doing is solidifying that line that we just did. Okay, which is fine. It's fine to make it thicker because we're going to keep applying different shades to give it a different hue, as it were. So we're just going to glaze it, and you can see wherever the last bit your paintbrush goes to, that's where the thickest, that's where most of the paint gets applied. So when you're doing that with blending and stuff, you always glaze from darkest to lightest. Okay, I know what you're thinking, it's probably a bit messy, but don't worry, it will all come together. Right, just wait for that to dry, it shouldn't take too long. Whilst that's drying, we're going to get our next green, which is Elysian Green. Okay, give that a shake, and we are going to do the same thing that we've just done. So we are going to go over our warg flesh with the Elysian Green, not being too heavy, being a bit lighter than before. And it doesn't matter, you probably don't want to do a complete solid line, so you could just sketch it on, you know, maybe leaving a few broken gaps of the warg flesh underneath. But it's all nice and random. Lightning is chaotic anyway. But where you've got these joining points, these nexuses, you do kind of want to make them a bit bolder to make it obvious that that's where the lightning is splitting. So I'm just working my way slowly. Whilst we're doing that, whilst that's drying, I'm going to do the other side. I'm going to go back to my wild flesh. We're just going to sketch more random outlines. Now if you did your sketch here like I did, but there's nothing to say that you have to redo it, it'll still be nice and fuzzy to kind of show you that there was maybe something forking there, but we don't have to enhance that anymore if you don't want to. It's quite an organic and satisfying process actually. Right. Before we move on, I'm just going to strengthen out these forks here, make them a bit bolder. Now that's done, we're going to do the same thing as we did with the warg flesh. We're going to make a bit of a glaze out of our Elysian Green. A bit thinner. Yep. And we are going to blur in these edges a bit more. Okay. It's the same thing, we're going to work from from outside in. But not going out as far as we did with the warg flesh. But again, you'll see it's going to add a bit of a blur and strengthen our lightning bolt at the same time. So as we're pulling the paint down, we're pulling it to the actual lightning bolt. What that's doing is it's creating a thinner transition on the far outside, furthest away from the crackle, and pulling the paint to the lightning bolt to make it more defined. You can see here, it's a good example of how the paint is faded at the top and it's pooling on top of the lightning bolt to give it its strength. So we're pulling the paint from the outside in. Okay. Right. So that's what that will look like when it's done. Now we need to sell the effect a bit more. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take our Elysian Green and add a bit of Screaming Skull just to lighten it. You can use white, but because I'm going to use pure white at the end, I think this will give it a better contrast. And mix it and thin it down so it's kind of this nice consistency. And once more we're going to drag our brush over the lightning bolts, but here we are not going to go the full way across them, just leave little dashes to kind of maybe do a few dots just to look like it's broken up. Again, we want to focus the strength of the colour on the forks, so that's where it'll be strongest. But again, I'm not going to do a solid line all the way down, letting it fade out maybe to the step we did before. Right, final piece of the puzzle. So you're going to get some pure white, whichever one you like. I'm not a fan of CITADEL. I find them too chalky and they always get clogged up. So I like the Vallejo one. I never had an issue with it. So I'm going to thin it down so it comes off the brush nicely. And then we're just going to pick strategic center points where the lightning forks to give it maximum contrast there. Again, lightning forks, and that should give it a nice kind of dynamic look to it. So you're going to do that for all the armour pieces, all around the Titan. And let's see how that looks when that's all done. There's 2 shoulder pads done, or pauldrons, whatever you want to call them. Got nice movement going over there. Alright, let's do that for the rest of the armour. So once you've done your shoulder pads, they should look something similar to this. I've put the guide together now. It's still not glued, but just temporarily put together so I can sketch out where I want the lightning on the top to go, because I'll probably try and tie it up with these so you get a nice flowing thing. And then we can see, underneath, that is our dry brushed area, and it's not too dissimilar from our airbrushed area. So for those who don't have an airbrush, don't despair, you can do it with a dry brush. It will just take a bit longer, that's all. If you want to add next kind of a few more effects like this to your armor panels, what you can do once you've done your main outlines, like here, you get your mixture with the Elysian Green and the Screaming Skull, and all we're going to do is we're just going to kind of faintly just drag our brush kind of very random but light patterns just from the edges into the main body that we've just painted, and that's going to kind of give it this kind of electrical crackle interference look, and you can use that to tie areas together. So we can kind of go what we're doing with this is we're just basically fading it out. It's very light. It's just giving us a bit of, so it looks like lightning that's been and gone, and it's still kind of in play, as it were. The more you kind of do this, because there's a lot of armor panels, the more you'll get comfortable once you're done, because what, yeah, kind of makes it look more alive without having to do any of the large things that we've done. So this kind of gives it like an ethereal, atmospheric, stormy background. Beauty of this is we don't need to do any of the glazing. You just want to get a nice point on your brush, just kind of drag it along like snail trails. Okay, you can do as much or as little as that as you want. Kind of helps fill in some gaps so it doesn't look so stark.